Well, finally, it seems that Ivy League universities and higher education in general have been greatly scrutinized due to the disastrous hearing in which several well-noted university presidents of top-ranked universities were questioned about their views on anti-Semitism in the wake of the October 7th attacks. But the focus of this video is going to be Ms. Claudine Gay, and not just Ms. Claudine Gay, but Claudine Gay, who was the president of Harvard, in the context of higher education, and how I believe that she is simply a single example of the moral weakness of the modern-day American higher education system, and not just the moral weakness, but also the principle that has been at the basis of the American higher educational system that has made it into the absolute monster that it is right now, that has made it into this haven of ideological indoctrination and conformity, which is absolutely antithetical to true education. Now, many of you may have heard that in the wake of Claudine Gay's testimony before Congress on anti-Semitism, where she was asked if she condemns anti-Semitism by Elise Stefanik and others, she basically said, and I'll play the clip, that there are certain contexts that matter when it comes to condemning harassment, when it comes to condemning anti-Semitism, and things of that sort. Watch it.
Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign.
Now, the basic point that should be made here is that harassment against anyone, against anybody, for any reason, should be condemned, whether it is against Jewish students or anyone else. Any person of common decency and of a sound moral character should be able to muster up the gumption to make that very basic pronouncement of human dignity. But the problem with the modern-day university system, which is really reflected in the tone and the response of Claudine Gay, is that moral character and moral conviction are not at the forefront of the agenda of the modern-day university system, but instead, their idea of education has nothing to do with practically learning things that will help you with the world, nor does that have anything to do with actually building up strong people who have good moral character and who have good skills. It has everything to do, generally, with the idea of education for education's sake. This is a German idea that is called Wissenschaft. And Wissenschaft has been at the basis of American higher education since about 1835. And it manifested first in the creation of universities like University of Michigan and also Johns Hopkins University, which is the leading medical institution of the world, whose original faculty in 1875 were all educated in Prussia, which is modern-day Germany, under the Prussian system of education. And they read people like Wilhelm von Humboldt, who believed that education was not to build up people so they have practical skills, that it wasn't to craft sound moral character, but it was instead to ensure allegiance to the state, and also, most importantly, to entertain ideas solely for the sake of entertaining ideas. If you want to understand Claudine Gay, her response, and the response of of the 700 plus professors at Harvard who have begged the Harvard Corporation not to fire her for her moral mealy-mouthed weakness, you have to understand what these universities are actually organized by. You have to understand what these universities actually believe. You have to understand what these universities are animated by. And so after a bunch of American educators came back from Germany in the 19th century and came back to America, they began implementing all these European concepts into higher education. And around this time is when the modern day research university became created. Now, Harvard University and many others like it all pride themselves on being research universities. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a research university. Research is great. But there's something wrong when your entire idea of education simply involves, as I mentioned, education for education's sake, where it's this sort of self-contained unit where you're just learning ideas to produce papers, present papers, and then going back and doing the same thing over again with no emphasis on the student. The truth is, this mentality that formed the modern-day research university, this Wissenschaft, this Prussian educational model, which has overtaken America's traditional form of education, which is primarily about morality and sound principles and not about society or consciousness, this model of education doesn't really care or see the student as a tangible object in the reality. It simply sees the student as a bystander in a longer process of pursuing ideas. That's why you can have Claudine Gay saying this kind of stuff with a straight face, because she is conditioned, or she is at least an agent, a harbinger, a leader of an institution based on this false idea of education called Wissenschaft. In order to render moral judgments, you have to acknowledge the existence of the individual. And in order to acknowledge the existence of the individual, you have to also acknowledge the existence of universal principles. And in order to do that, you have to be willing not to consign everything to context, but simply understand there is a right and there is a wrong, and those two things are true regardless of context. Context may inform how I interact with those universal truths, but those universal truths are not crafted by context. They are simply informed by context. Yet Claudine Gay's answer on anti-Semitism has to do solely with viewing moral values and moral statements as a matter of context. Wissenschaft. Now, Wissenschaft eventually created the environment for other leftist ideas that have crept into universities to invade universities and sort of be factories to be refined there by academics, whether these ideas be intersectionality, whether they be postmodernism more generally, which came from the universities. All of these ideas had fertile ground because the principle informing how these institutions run is education for the sake of education, the student itself be damned. So not only was the first principle of American universities for the past 200 plus years, with very few exceptions, been about Wissenschaft, but also the universities have gotten even further from the student due to the perverse relationship with the federal government and other sort of for-profit forces, bolstering the power of universities to literally if you want, extort students and dupe them into a bad financial deal based on cultural ideas of college having some kind of value. That may have been true 50 years ago, but it is not true anymore. And this broader phenomenon that I'm talking about here becomes even more evident when we consider Claudine Gay's plagiarism allegations. Now, many of you may have heard that Claudine Gay was accused of plagiarism. He was accused of inadequately citing or not citing and paraphrasing without citation several things in some academic papers she wrote. Now, there was a report that came out that said that while it did find inadequate citations, these are not necessarily plagiarism, even though the same kind of conduct conducted by a student would have absolutely resulted in academic discipline. But Claudine Gay, according to the Harvard Corporation, is not subject to the same kind of standards. Now, this is not simply hypocrisy. It's very easy to say this is hypocrisy. This is something much deeper. This is an education system that, once again, is not informed by concrete matters of right and wrong, but is instead informed by the abstract experimentation with ideas. Consequences of those ideas for society be damned. They don't matter according to this model. It is them continuing to toy with ideas to justify otherwise unjustifiable behavior, even by a standard they themselves hold. Do you see the contradictions of the modern day higher education system? Do you see the contradictions of Wissenschaft? Do you see the contradictions of these ideas that have informed for over almost 200 years, 1835 was almost 200 years ago, have informed the higher education system? The contradictions are glaring, they are stark, and they are also startling and concerning. And yet, without a sound knowledge of the history of the higher education system in America, and without a sound knowledge of philosophy, many people are left defenseless against this kind of manipulation. They will instead cater towards cultural motifs and archetypes that somehow justify going into institutions that don't even care about you, but care more about how their status can raise by how many papers they write, how many research grants they get from the Defense Department, and other kind of things that have nothing to do with building moral character and nothing to do with building individual skill and expertise, and more to do with appeasing yourself to those in that realm that believe those things actually matter. How are millions of kids in America falling prey to this system? Because no one is thinking through the implications of this system in a way that is not superficial, and in a way that is substantive. Claudine Gay, as I mentioned, is simply an avatar, an archetype for the kind of menace that has overtaken the education system, higher education system in America, because in some sense, it was always like that. It's been like this for centuries now. And so we have to really ask ourselves, in light of this Wissenschaft, in light of this mealy-mouthed appeasement to mediocrity, in light of this rhetorical manipulation from the Harvard Corporation that excuses obviously inexcusable conduct for the sake of status, in light of everything, we must ask ourselves, is it worth it to continue valuing a system and institutions within that system on the basis of them being luminaries in society, on the basis of them actually providing benefit to society, when in all reality, as is evidenced by not only their nature, but also evidenced by all kind of things that have happened over the past few decades, whether it be Harvard themselves writing back a few decades ago that we should have some kind of animus towards white people, whether it be going all the way back to the days of Bill Buckley and others who wrote about these issues in their time, using academic freedom as a shield to justify indoctrination and browbeating people with different ideas. Is it worth it in this society to continue perpetuating these institutions at the risk of our progeny, at the risk of the intellectual mind, of the health of the intellectual mind of our society? It's not. It's not. The biggest takeaway from the recent hearings should not be, and the events that ensued afterwards, should not be just that anti-Semitism has ran rampant across universities in America. It has, and we must condemn that. But it should also be that the very nature of the education system itself, built on entertaining ideas solely for the sake of ideas, and not for building up things in the real world, and not for building up the character of man, as described by William von Humboldt, we should understand that this model is fundamentally toxic, and we should also understand that this model informs a vast majority of how education is conducted in America today, on both the high school level and the college level. And we should also doubly understand, or triple understand, that until we are willing to call out this rot that is inherent to so many of our institutions, not all of them, but many of them, we will continue to get the kind of rhetoric, the kind of thinking, the kind of mediocrity that we have seen from universities when they have to confront morally consequential issues like antisemitism and others. If you want a new standard, you must establish a new standard. And to establish a new standard, you must abolish ones that are not good. Let us abolish the standard that has been centered in higher education for hundreds of years. And let us seek a individual-centered, person-centered education system that appeals not to society or social consciousness or to abstractions, but appeals fundamentally to the basic principles that human beings need to flourish in a free and civil society. That way, Claudine Gay and other people of her ilk will no longer have the power and prestige and the luxury to be mediocre as they do today, but instead, there will be people that actually understand the real value of education and who can then take the reins and hopefully lead our institutions on a good path anew. My friends, like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel, Be sure to also, if you want to help me, donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, my locals, all that stuff in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, and most importantly, stay pensive. Bye, everyone.